Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we take our final step before reaching the landmark 50th issue with Spawn number 49. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in May of 1996, and holy crap, look how good this cover is. Greg Capullo, Danny Miki, and Brian Haberlin knocked this one out of the park, man. I mean, yes, it's incredibly wild, it's off the wall, it's super busy, but at the same time, think about when this cover was initially on the shelf. There was no way you were walking by this in the comic book store without giving it a second look. This is the absolute perfect example of how to make an eye-catching cover that everyone's going to be like, wow, what's going on here? I got to know more about what's going on inside this book. Story, Todd McFarlane. Pencils, Greg Capullo. Inks, Danny Miki. Copy editor and letters, Tom Orzechowski. Colors, Brian Haberlin, Dan Kemp. The story begins with Spawn ditching the costume so that he can wear a disguise and visit Granny Blake once again, something he hasn't done since issue number 38. He knocks and asks if he can come in. She immediately tells him that he never asked to ask permission and that he's always welcome in her home. She then goes on to say that she actually wishes that Al would show up more frequently and visit her. He apologizes that it's been so long since he's been to her home, but tells her that he's been trying to get quite a few things in order, which is why he's here today. He tells her that it seems as though everything is spiraling out of control and that he doesn't know what the next thing he should do is, and that he feels like everything is going awry and there's nothing he can do to stop it. Granny Blake immediately tries to reassure Al and tell him that God never gives us anything more than we can handle, and that she knows that while this may be a burdensome task for Al, that she's sure that he has what it takes to deal with this and live up to the expectations that God has for him. Now, keep in mind, Granny Blake is still under the impression that Al did in fact go to heaven after he died and is now an angel serving God, a point which he has never actually corrected her on. Ever steadfast in her faith, Granny Blake reminds Al that God chose him to be an angel for a reason, and that those reasons remain a mystery to everyone but him, including Al, who lives in heaven with God. Again, this is Granny under the assumption that Al went to heaven when he died. She then tells Al that he must remain faithful and believe that God will handle everything in the end. However, Al tells her that it's not this simple and that he can't control what's happening to him and it's putting others in danger, including her. She asks Al what he means, and he tells her that he believes that it's not safe for him to come and visit her anymore. However, she immediately interrupts and tells him not to say such a thing. She tells Al that while she is old and blind, she's not stupid, and she's been aware that something's been bothering him for quite some time. She then tells him that at this point, he must trust in people around him to face these inner demons, that there are people who love him and want to help him, but he has to let them in if he wants to make a breakthrough with whatever this problem is. She then goes on to tell Al that at this point, he has to face his inner demons and conquer them if he wants to make any progress in going forward, and he has to accept the Lord's help if he wants to do that. At this point, Al decides that it's time for himself to leave, as he simply says, "I'm sorry, goodbye," and walks out the door. Meanwhile, across town, we see that Terry Fitzgerald has finally taken the advice of his wife and gone to visit the doctor to find out what's wrong with him. Now, this is triggered by the fact that he had a fainting spell in the previous issue and is now very worried about what might be happening to his body. The doctor tells him that he's going to order him a test by a specialist, and this seems to rather startle Terry as he asks, "Why? What's wrong with me?" However, Terry's doctor tries to put his mind at ease, telling him that he's hopeful nothing is wrong, and that these tests are simply to rule out anything more serious. Terry agrees to get the test done as he gets himself dressed and walks out of the office, the doctor once again telling him not to worry. However, Terry then once again goes into a coughing fit as he begins to think to himself that he may have waited too long to see the doctor, and curses himself for not having done so sooner, as this might be something more serious and he may have waited too long to do anything about it. We're then teleported to Rat City, where we see Spawn's makeshift fortress of solitude, as it were, made out of all of the garbage of the alleyways that he's created as a means of quarantining himself from the rest of the alleys, as he's worried that he can no longer control the costume. We then see his cape and chains flailing at the entryway to this prison that he's constructed, as we see Cagliostro approach from outside of the alleys, thinking to himself, "My God, Al, what have you done to yourself?" Also, I'd like to point out, I find it rather interesting that Granny Blake's advice was not too dissimilar from the advice that Cagliostro's been giving to Spawn for quite some time, telling him that he has to face his problems head on and that he can no longer keep running from them. The cape and chains continue to flail and throw garbage all over the alleyway as we see Cagliostro make his way through this labyrinth of trash, dodging all of the chains and cape, which aren't necessarily targeting him directly, they're just acting erratically. As he continues to fight his way through, he is concerned that the costume has an infection, and that if Al doesn't regain control and expel this infection soon, the costume will in fact reach Necro State 9, whatever the hell that is, before it's ready. And if it does so, all hope is lost, as it will kill everything. He continues to fight his way through all of the garbage until he finally reaches the inner sanctum, where he sees Spawn and simply states, "Al, oh my God, no." Also, as all of this is happening, Spawn is dealing with his own inner monologue as he thinks to himself that he can no longer fight off the cape, that it was born of hell and is pure evil and is trying to make Spawn evil as well. He then thinks to himself that he's done nothing but fight his whole life, and look where it's gotten him. He has no one and nothing, and that he's all alone, and that he's reached a point where he believes he's no longer capable of trying to fight off all of this, and he's going to succumb to becoming what the Mabolja always wanted him to be. Meanwhile, in another section of the city's alleyways, we see the Violator in his clown form toying with a rat as he laments having to deal with Jason Wynn. While he does respect how evil Wynn is, he's rather disheartened by how subservient he seems to be, how willing he is to just take orders and do whatever the Violator tells him to do without any question. He then states that if Wynn is really the best that humanity has to offer, that he could easily be king of this entire planet within a month if he wanted to. However, we then see him suddenly stop and go wide-eyed as he immediately starts to recognize and sense the struggle that Al is having with his costume. He then starts to cackle wildly and exclaim the word "yes," as he tells the rat that this is the best case scenario. He knew that Simmons was having problems with his costume, but he didn't realize they were this severe, and that this is going to save him months of groundwork. He'll no longer have to deal with Wynn or Blake or Fitzgerald, as if this all comes to pass, the costume is going to do all the work for him, and Simmons is going to have a one-way ticket back to hell, which is the best case scenario for him, as we see him plop the rat into his mouth and chomp down, eating it as a snack. As we return to Rat City, we see on full display the horrific condition of Spawn's costume, as the tumor has exploded out of his body and is actually managing to subdue him inside of the alleyways. Cog is cursing Mabolja as Spawn continues to try and stay alive, as not only the tumor but his own innards start to spill out of him. One of the tumors then springs out a tendril which grabs Cagliostro and lifts him into the air. Cog immediately screams out to Spawn, "Al, you have to fight through the pain. It's feeding off of your emotions." Now, during all of this, Spawn is focused wholly on his anger towards God, as he blames God for his current predicament. His reasoning being that God created Satan, Satan created hell, hell created Mabolja, and Mabolja created the costume. This means, as far as Spawn is concerned, that God wants this to happen to him. However, he, interestingly enough, admits that his own logic is flawed, as it does actually remove any culpability from him and the decisions that he made in his own life, which led him to this moment. The tumor then grows a large worm-like monster out of itself with a sharp tooth-filled mouth. The tendril brings Cagliostro closer to this worm mouth. However, Spawn is rather surprised by the fact that Cog doesn't seem in the least bit worried and actually appears to be more annoyed than anything. The worm-like creature then eats Cogliostro whole. However, it then begins to writhe and convulse and suddenly has to vomit Cog out of itself back into the alleyway. As Cog gets his bearings, he recites some sort of otherworldly language that Spawn doesn't understand, and we see the tumor suddenly start to dissipate and retract back into the costume as the costume transforms back to its normal state. As Spawn finally reverts back to his normal form, he passes out and collapses on the ground. Cog rushes to his side, and as he comes to, Cog tells him that he has to learn how to fight and harness the power, and that he must cage the demons. Spawn believes these are more riddles, but he also realizes that he's at a point where he can no longer do this on his own, as he looks up at Cog and says, "Please help me." Cog says, "That's what I've been trying to do the whole time. Why do you think I'm here? It's because of you. My appearance is not an accident, and neither is yours. We need each other, and so do our souls," which is a very mysterious thing to be saying to Spawn at this point that we're going to find out more about later on. We are then teleported to the specialist office that Terry was instructed to see as the specialist goes over his chart. Terry is constantly fiddling about and starting to become more and more agitated as he worries more and more about his health. However, the doctor finally tells him that everything looks in order and that these tests are really just standard procedure and it's nothing to really get that worried about. However, while Terry tries to remain calm and collective, he constantly thinks to himself that he's dying the whole time. "Yeah, I've been there myself, Terry. I get you, brother." The doctor then explains to Terry that while it's not uncommon for people to experience a blackout once in their life, he wants to rule out anything that could be more serious, as he shows Terry an example of an X-ray of a human brain and points out exactly the kind of thing he's looking for. He then tells Terry that the test results will be back in a few days and will give him a clearer picture of exactly what Terry's health condition is. However, this worries Terry as it means he's going to have to keep his wife Wanda in the dark for even longer, something that he's already been uncomfortable doing. Meanwhile, back at his office, his secretary is helping in this as she lies to Wanda and tells her that Terry is stuck in a meeting and can't come to the phone while he's actually at the doctor's office. However, this starts to get a rise out of Wanda as she believes something is up, as she doesn't recall Terry telling her before he left that day that he had any kind of important meeting going on at work. We are then teleported to what I believe is supposed to be the Queensboro Bridge, though I'm not entirely certain, where we see that Cy-Gor has finally made it all the way to New York City as he scales up the bridge and yells out Simmons from the top. We are now well aware that he has been traveling to New York for quite some time, though before this we didn't know why, and as it turns out, he's here for Al Simmons, though again, no idea as to why this is. We also don't know why he's being depicted as a silverback gorilla who is really good at climbing. This is something that has irked me for years. So often in pop culture media, whether it be movies, television, or in this case, comic books, silverback gorillas are depicted as being highly arboreal, which they are not. They are terrestrial. They are not good at climbing, they are big and heavy, and they are not suited for living in trees, which is why they live on the ground. But so often, they're always depicted in this manner. And I think it's just because, since they're apes, it's just kind of assumed by the people who are creating this media that they just are naturally good at climbing, which is not the case. That is something that you would see in an orangutan or a chimpanzee, but not a silverback gorilla. Again, I know I'm nitpicking about this kind of stuff, but it is something that always kind of irks me whenever I see it. We then see Terry Fitzgerald driving home from the doctor's office, thinking to himself that this could not have happened at a worse time, as he's actually very close to finally being able to prove all of Jason Wynn's wrongdoings. However, as he continues to drive, his vision begins to get blurry and he once again blacks out. As he loses consciousness and slumps over the wheel, his car goes out of control and begins to careen head-on towards a tractor trailer. Terry then suddenly regains consciousness and recognizes the immediate danger he's in as he tries to swerve but is too late and crashes head on into the truck, losing consciousness once again. We are then teleported to the drive-thru of a burger world, and that bee certainly looks like a set of golden arches turned on its side, doesn't it? Sam and Twitch are grabbing dinner when suddenly Sam's car starts to act up as Twitch is trying to fiddle with it, getting it in gear, and there's a loud bang. Twitch jumps out of the car with his gun drawn, stating that he believes the shot came from inside of the building. However, Sam immediately realizes what's going on and grabs the gun out of his partner's hand. He tells Twitch that he's been very jumpy as of late and asks him what's going on. Twitch tells him that he's just worried about what happened to them back at the office and is wondering whether or not someone's been tailing them. He then realizes that they now no longer have a car to use and is worried because Sam has already spent all of the funds he had been saving up. However, Sam tells him that there was some money left over and that he's got a special surprise for Twitch as he holds up a set of keys. Meanwhile, at the home of Wanda Blake and Terry Fitzgerald, we see that Wanda is doing some ironing when the phone suddenly rings. When she answers, she is greeted by a police officer who informs her of the terrible accident that Terry has been in and tells her that he's been transported to a nearby hospital. Fearing the absolute worst, Wanda simply drops the phone in horror as we reach the end of the issue. We then get to image info. This is nothing special, just a rundown of upcoming comics of 1996, so I'm not going to get into it. We then, of course, reach the spawning ground, the letter section, where people can potentially have their fan letters answered by Todd directly in the pages of Spawn. And there were some definite interesting ones this month. The first one is a kid writing in talking about how for a time his mother had stopped him from buying Spawn as she seemed very concerned about the content of Spawn and was a little bit skeptical about whether or not her son should be reading it. But she ultimately did change her mind and allow him to start buying the comics again. However, Todd's response to this was actually pretty cool as he told the kid, listen, I know that was kind of hard for you to go through, but at the same time, you should be really thankful that your mom is taking the kind of interest in your life that she is. As he goes on to explain about how he's seen a lot of bad situations through his travels across the country and that a lot of kids don't have any parents or only have single parent households. And very oftentimes their parents are rather uninvolved in their lives, and that it's really refreshing for him to see a mom who's taking an active role in her son's upbringing. The next one is someone who is a little bit upset about the crossovers that Todd was doing, and he also asks a series of questions, one of which is why Todd changed the name of Tremor from Blood. Those of you who saw my episode on Image number 0 may recall that Tremor was featured within the pages of that issue and was originally named Blood. Now, Todd explains that he changed the name to Tremor because he felt that for as often as Rob Liefeld was using blood in the titles and different names of his characters and comic books, that he didn't want to actually step on the extreme universe, as it were. So he decided to change the name to Tremor, which is kind of odd given that I wouldn't have thought of it that way. I just thought Blood was kind of a, generic name, and Tremor feels like a little bit more unique. But I guess that was the reason behind it. Another one that I found interesting was that there was a woman who wrote in, and she was a Black woman. And this is important for a reason. As she stated that one of the reasons that she really enjoyed reading Spawn was because of the positive portrayal of Black men that Todd puts into the pages of Spawn. As she goes on to state that so much of the media of 1996 and prior always portrayed Black men in a very negative light as very thuggish, very uncaring, very unintelligent men. And she really liked that Todd portrayed the Black men in his story in such a positive light of being caring family men and very well educated and having good jobs and having a sense of duty and self, and also a duty or a sense of selflessness in the care of their families and the protection of the people they loved. Though she did go on to point out that she was also a devout Christian and was very offended by the frequency with which Todd uses the Lord's name in vain in his comic books. Now, Todd only responded to that part of her letter and explained to her that as an atheist, the words of taking the Lord's name in vain don't really have any meaning to him. It would be the same as if instead of saying Jesus Christ, he were to say Santa Claus. And I get his point, that for him, it doesn't have that same sort of meaning. But at the same time, I don't think that really discredits her criticism and why it would be something that would be offensive to her. But at the same time, I also think she needs to realize that trying to expect the rest of the world to adhere to a set of moral standards that she believes in isn't necessarily always going to work out, and that she has to learn that when there are people who don't have the same beliefs as her, they're not always going to consider the feelings of offensiveness or morality that she may associate with certain words that they don't. And it's a very fine line that Todd has to walk here in terms of presenting a comic that has some semblance of realism as it pertains to the actual world, while also realizing that there are consequences to the actions that he takes within the comic book, and that ultimately, no matter what he does, he's never going to please everyone. And, I understand this woman's criticism, but at the same time, she's still buying the comic book. So I believe that she might be actually making a little bit bigger deal out of this than she truly thinks it really is. We then get a couple of really cool pinups, and I wish I could give credit to exactly who worked on these, but I can't because I can't read their signatures. The only thing I can tell you is that Danny Meeke was the inker on this one, and that I believe Kevin Conrad was the inker on this one, as theirs are the only two signatures I can read. And let that be a lesson to any potential aspiring comic book artists who may or may not be watching this. When you learn to sign your name for your comic book art, you can make it look cool, but you might also want to make it legible as well so that people actually know what your signature is and who they can credit the work to. We then reach the end cap, which is talking about some upcoming figures for the 1996 toy line, notably Pilgrim and Mendoza from Wetworks and the 13-inch Angela and Spawn. Though there is some interesting information in this month's end cap, notably they make a point to explain the difference between a repaint and a variant. A repaint being on purpose and a variant being an accident, which is why variants are usually worth more money. Also, there's an interesting point made where someone asks about the offering of a figure in the pages of Action Figure Price Guide, where it talks about a figure upcoming in the McFarlane Toys line referred to as Executor, spelled X-E-Q space T-O-R, Executor. And they asked what happened to that figure. Well, as it turns out, that figure came out. And the reason that nobody realized it is because Executor was the original name that Todd thought he was going to change the anti-spawn to, when he realized that name was stupid and instead decided to call him the Redeemer, which is a much better name. I find it funny that Todd was trying to do these weird, hyphenated words for the characters at one point. Like I said here, the Executor. And also, if you recall, Cy-Gor's original name was supposed to be Apex, which was APE-X, like Ape X. That name also sucks. Cy-Gor is a way better name. I don't know what Todd was doing at that time, where he was just throwing out these oddball names only to realize later on that they kind of stunk and that he could do better. But it is funny to go back and find out that, we really dodged some bullets with what some of these characters might have been called. We then get the Spawn Direct mail-away form. I'm not going to talk about this because we've seen it dozens of times at this point. On the final page of the book, we get an advertisement for the Wizard Spawn special, which I am desperately looking for because I really want to see all 8 of the free Spawn posters that are within this issue. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for the San Diego Comic-Con, where you'll be able to see live and in person the Sam and Twitch Crime Mobile. Now, there's just one problem. This advertisement is being printed before the Crime Mobile has been unveiled within the pages of Spawn. This, of course, being the surprise that Sam was alluding to Twitch about. I don't know why they would have done it this way. It seems to me like you would have waited until after you had unveiled this car in the pages of Spawn to then make an advertisement that you could go see it in real life at the San Diego Comic-Con. But of course, this is just one more item in the long list of mistimed, printings of advertisements and comic books and miniseries that were happening all throughout Spawn at this point. So I guess I really shouldn't be that surprised. And that was Spawn number 49. And while overall I do believe this was a pretty good issue, I also think it suffers from being a setup issue. This issue's purpose is to set up a lot of story elements and payoffs that are going to happen in issue number 50. And as a result, I feel like this one suffers a little from it because so much of the story points that are happening in this issue feel very confusing or mysterious or cliffhangery. And again, that's all on purpose. It has to be that way for what it's trying to be a prelude to. Unfortunately, it also then starts to detract a little from what's going on in this issue and can feel a little disjointed when you read this issue on its own. But then again, these are just my opinions. Your opinion may be that this issue was exciting and perfect from cover to cover, and if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.